We've got a good group here, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to start by welcoming all of you to the press briefing for CDT's Fall 2020 Election Security Press Briefing. We are going to try and cover a lot of information on election security, on misinformation, on voter suppression, and on cybersecurity for election equipment today. And with that, I'll turn it over to our CEO, Alexandra Givens, for a few words.
Great, thanks, E. Hi, everybody. Really nice to see you all today. I thought I'd give you just a minute on CDT for those of you who don't know us, and then preview why we're focusing so much on this work right now in the run-up to the election. CDT is a 25-year-old organization that's focused on advancing tech policy and architecture solutions that protect users and democratic values. Our team brings together lawyers and technologists and social scientists for cross-disciplinary expertise. And while our main hub is in DC and we're very focused on domestic policy, we also have an office in Brussels and do a lot of work in the European policymaking sphere as well. We cover a range of issues from consumer privacy to government surveillance to internet standards to the very live topic these days of platform governance and free expression. As you'll hear today, we also lead a substantial program focused on election security. And for all of these, we're very happy to be a resource for you. We're holding today's briefing because we want to provide you with factual information that we think is simply essential in covering the upcoming election. In addition to today's briefing, we've held trainings and produced support materials for election officials and state attorneys general. We've produced 2 PSAs that our team will share in the chat. And CDT also brought litigation against the Trump administration's executive order on social media earlier this summer, which seeks to deter social media services from adding fact-checking content or otherwise responding to voter suppression efforts on their platforms. Our goal through all of these efforts, through the education we're doing, the outreach to election officials and state AGs, the litigation, is to promote free, fair, and most importantly, informed elections, to promote the integrity of our democracy by ensuring that voters can get the facts. In covering the elections, we often see articles stating that, for example, that allegations about fraud and mail-in voting are inaccurate, but few articles go that one sentence deeper to actually show the reader why mail-in voting systems are secure. The public knows about the existence of disinformation, but we think it's really important to help them understand specific examples and how to spot it. With the polarized public exposure we find ourselves in today, we believe that these are just essential components to educating readers in the run-up to the election. So that's the substance that we want to share with you today. And again, we do hope that this will be useful to you and that you can enter into dialogue with all of us. We're going to get started now with our Senior Technologist for Elections and Democracy, Will Adler. I'll pass it over to you. But again, thank you all for joining us, and I hope we can continue to be a resource for you. Will?
Thanks, Alex. And hi, everyone. We're so glad you're all here, and we're excited to have the chance to talk to you. And again, like Elizabeth said, I encourage you to ask questions in the chat. We're only 18 days out from the election, so I know you might have some pressing questions. I also want to say thanks to all of you. I think so many reporters are doing just an amazing job of covering some of the topics that I'm going to talk about today so quickly and accurately. So I'm going to talk about why absentee voting is secure and why widespread fraud is so rare. I'm going to talk about the absentee voting wars, which is what I'm calling the efforts to expand absentee voting on the one hand, and on the other hand, competing efforts to restrict it, and then in-person voter intimidation, which kind of rests on this widespread fraud myth this year, it seems. So for years, CDT has focused on how to make elections more secure and accessible, with a particular focus on cybersecurity and voting machines. So as you know, states have a number of ways to make elections secure. There are minimum federal standards that states have policies and guidance to ensure that voters are registered. States have individual laws and regulations. And all these things are meant to ensure that voters are registered, that voter registration databases are protected, and that voters have a variety of ways to vote, and so on. But COVID has thrown a curveball this year, which is this spring, many states made moves to massively expand eligibility for their existing absentee or mail-in systems. And I'm just going to talk about the security of absentee ballots for this talk because there's so much misinformation and disinformation out there about it. But I'm also happy to take questions on other aspects of election security and integrity. So with that, I'm going to try to share my slides here. All right, everybody can see the slides? Cool. So I'm going to use the terms absentee and mail-in interchangeably because some states call it one, some call it the other, but for the most part, it's just a semantic distinction. Every state has some form of absentee voting and has had so for years. Absentee voting has existed since 1864, which is the year of Abraham Lincoln's re-election. And at the time, it was intended for soldiers in the Civil War to vote, and it has remained an important option for military voters, overseas voters, disabled voters, elderly voters, and it's really nothing new for the states. 5 states have been conducting elections almost entirely by mail for years without widespread problems, and it's basically impossible to commit mail-in fraud at the scale you would need to swing an election. Oregon has been doing vote by mail the longest. They've been mailing ballots to all voters for 20 years, and they have only had 2 fraud cases out of 50 million ballots cast. Similarly, Colorado has been mailing ballots to every voter since 2013, and they've had 3. These frequencies of fraud are about 5 times less likely than the odds of getting struck by lightning in your lifetime. But with the increase in absentee and the uncertainty around this voting method that's new to so many voters, there's been a lot of misinformation, such as absentee voting leads to widespread fraud by voters, or it allows officials to rig elections, or it allows foreign actors to mail in entirely fake ballots. But this is just not the case, as state legislatures recognized in their rapid expansion of absentee eligibility this spring. So I just want to give a sense of the life of an absentee ballot and the security measures at each point. Oh, there's my outline. And to make it concrete, I'm just going to pick Michigan and its security checks as an example. And as it happens, over 1 million people have already returned their absentee ballots in Michigan this year. So the first step is a voter registration application. And with this voter registration application, you have to provide identifying information like driver's license, date of birth, social security number, and an attestation under penalty of perjury that you are who you say you are and that you're eligible. Once you do that, each election, you need to complete an application for an absentee ballot. You need to provide identifying information exactly as it appears on your registration. If you're applying online, there are additional checks. So you need to provide your eye color, the last 4 of your social, and you need to provide another sworn statement, as well as a signature for verification. And they do match this to the signature on your voter file. And it's not just perfunctory. This July, the Michigan Attorney General charged a woman with forging her daughter's signature at this on the ballot application in order to obtain a ballot in her daughter's name, and her daughter lived out of state. So people do get caught under these checks. Then a blank ballot is mailed to the voter. Importantly, every ballot is linked to a particular voter. So the return envelope that the voter sends it back in has a barcode linking it to that voter's entry in the voter registration database. The voter completes and returns the ballot, another sworn statement, a signature that is again going to be matched to the signature that's on file. And then the voter returns it either by mail or by drop box. And by the way, as an aside, these drop boxes are ridiculously strong. This is a picture that was shared by a county in Washington of something that happened last year where a driver went on a rampage and happened to hit a drop box. And the drop box was fine. They just stood it up and it had some tire treads and some scratches on it, but basically fine. And then once it makes it through all these steps, the ballot is processed. Once there's the weight of the paper is checked to make sure it's the same ballot. There's a barcode check and another signature match. And as of last week in Michigan, there's a notification and cure process, which means that if the signature doesn't match, then officials have 48 hours to notify the voter and allow them to cure the ballot deficiency and make sure their ballot is counted. Oh, and here's a screenshot from Colorado's signature verification guide. They have a pretty comprehensive guide to how officials should be matching signatures. And this just says the first clue is the slant, but it's a long document that goes into all the other things that could be considered. And just like in various aspects of administration of in-person voting, many of the steps in here are carried out by bipartisan teams of election workers. So in some cases, retrieving ballots, verifying signatures, scanning ballots, these all have to be carried out by both a Republican official and a Democratic official. Some states, I don't know if Michigan is one of these, they lock facilities. They double lock them so that you need both a Democratic key and a Republican key to get in. So from all these checks, we can see that except in the case of major error by election officials, it's impossible to print and mail fake ballots. That's because of things like the barcode check, like the fact that every ballot is tied to a voter in the voter registration database means you just can't print, like a foreign power could not just print and mail in a bunch of ballots and have them be counted. And it's also impossible for an individual voter to vote multiple times. Again, the same checks. When a ballot comes in, they can check off that voter and they know if that voter has voted. And also for an individual to commit absentee fraud, they would have to do one or more of the following, which is make false attestations, putting them at severe risk of penalties. And they'd have to know information about other specific voters in order to do various parts of this process. So there's really not much of an incentive for the individual fraudster. So if we take the previous example that I mentioned of the person trying to vote on behalf of her daughter, that's just one extra vote. It's extremely unlikely to make a difference in any race. It's just not worth it. And to do this at scale, to swing an election would require you to coordinate fraudsters en masse. You'd have to convince lots of people that it's worth it to do it. You'd be exposing lots of people. You're pretty likely to be caught and charged with a felony. And so these checks and penalties, they do work. People do get caught and prosecuted. But so the question is, would more burdensome security checks reduce fraud even more? Well, maybe. But with all these things, there's a trade-off between enfranchisement and authentication. So the question of, for how strictly to enforce or what the laws should be is, how are we striking that balance? How much fraud do we have on the one hand, and on the other hand, how much disenfranchisement do we have? So if we have a lot of ballot fraud, then we should have more authentication measures. But if we have a lot of ballot disqualification, maybe we don't need to worry so much about making it even harder to vote. The Heritage Foundation maintains a database of voter fraud cases over the last 20 years, and they have 145 people convicted of fraud using mailed ballots. And these cases, if you look into the details, are kind of like the last one. It's usually like one person trying to vote on behalf of a family member. So this comes out to about one case per state every 7 years, which is not frequent at all. That's 60 millionths of 1% of all absentee ballots cast in the last 20 years. Whereas by contrast, the Election Assistance Commission reports statistics on ballot rejection. And in last year, in 2018, the last federal election alone, 425,000 ballots were rejected out of 30 million. And the reasons for this are commonly a missed deadline, a non-matching signature, or no signature at all. So you can see that the scale of fraud here is just not comparable to the number of ballots that get disqualified due to the security measures that do exist. The number of absentee ballots disqualified in 1 year is 3,000 times higher than the number of criminal convictions of absentee fraud in 20 years. So in the view of most people who study this, given how low the current rates of fraud are, states should be thinking about expanding eligibility and making sure that the restrictions are minimally burdensome. And luckily, many are. Many states have changed their policies, as indicated by the yellow highlight in this Washington Post graphic. They've changed their policies to mail out applications or ballots themselves to registered voters. They've been extending deadlines. They've been expanding the number of ballot drop-off points for voters who don't want to vote in person, but also distrust the mail. And they've been loosening overly burdensome voter authentication restrictions. So for instance, the Secretary of State in Pennsylvania issued guidance to counties saying that they should not throw out a ballot purely only because there's a signature mismatch, given all of the other security checks along the way. And the Pennsylvania Supreme Court actually just upheld that guidance. And then finally, making sure that there's a cure process if there is deficiency. If you're going to have a signature match policy, then you have to have a way for voters to get notified if their signature is judged not to match, and have a way to fix it. But we're also seeing efforts to litigate these measures in an attempt to make it harder to vote or less likely that absentee votes will be counted. So before this year, the most common example of weaponizing voter authentication measures like this was voter ID laws. Voter ID requirements are a security measure that is targeted against a specific kind of fraud called in-person impersonation fraud. But there are only 13 recorded cases of impersonation fraud in this database over the last 20 years. By contrast, voter ID laws have probably deterred thousands of registered voters from voting. So these laws are unwarranted and they disenfranchise voters who are less likely to have a photo ID, such as voters of color, voters who are poor, and voters who are elderly. But we're now seeing the same tactics applied to absentee voting. So the president, his campaign, Attorney General Barr have been spreading disinformation and conspiracy theories about mail-in voting. As recently as the town hall last night, I don't know how many of you saw it, he incorrectly and misleadingly referred to a few incidents of election official error as evidence of widespread fraud. But these things are entirely different. So he referred to a couple states where states mailed out incorrect ballots or pre-filled ballot application forms with the wrong information. These are errors by election officials, but they can't be leveraged. There's no way to leverage them into widespread fraud, but the confusion there is being exploited by the president. And polling has shown that this campaign has disproportionately caused Republican voters to distrust this method of voting. And you can also see in states that are reporting party registration statistics on return mail-in ballots, that a return mail-in ballot is more than twice as likely to be associated with a registered Democratic voter than a registered Republican voter. So while absentee voting has typically not favored either party and has historically actually been promoted by Republicans to make it easier for elderly voters to vote, this disinformation campaign has effectively partisanized the absentee vote, creating an incentive for Republicans to target absentee ballots for disqualification. So even though many states have been making great efforts to make it easier to vote by mail and make it more likely that a mail-in vote will be counted, we've been seeing lots of litigation by the Trump campaign and others to shorten the windows in which ballots can be requested, postmarked, and received, limit the availability of ballot drop boxes and ballot drop-off points. So this is playing out most in Texas, where Texas had multiple drop-off points per county, and then the governor required counties to just have one drop-off point per county, which in the case of Harris County, for instance, which is extremely populous, there's millions and millions, there's about 2.5 million registered voters there, I think, and they have only one drop box for the entire county. And this, the most populous counties in Texas are heavily Black and Hispanic. So, and there's also evidence that Black voters distrust mail-in voting and prefer to use drop-off points. So this is another targeted measure. And then efforts to, there's litigation requiring witness signatures and requiring use of secrecy envelopes, which are arguably an unnecessary measure in Pennsylvania that is mostly going to serve to disqualify voters. So all of these things are likely to have the effect of disenfranchising not just Democratic voters, but elderly voters, disabled voters, voters who are most at risk of COVID, voters who are most fearful of going to polling places, regardless of their political preference. And the Trump campaign is also using the specter of a rigged election to call for increased in-person poll watching. So President Trump talked about poll watching in the debate with Biden, calling it a very safe, very nice thing. And poll watching, you know, it has a long history, and most states have laws that allow some form of poll watching, which at its best enables various forms of public oversight of voter operations. But this too can be weaponized. So famously in 1981, the RNC conducted a poll watching campaign aimed at suppressing the Black vote in a governor's race in New Jersey. They conducted an operation of what's called voter caging. And voter caging is when you send out mail to a bunch of addresses on the voter rolls. And in this case, they just targeted voters in Black neighborhoods. Then you look at the undeliverable mail that comes back and you challenge the registration of those voters. In this case, they actually used an outdated voter roll, so they were rebuffed. But they still, instead they sent off-duty armed police officers with armbands that said National Ballot Security Task Force to patrol the polling places and ask for people's ID, which people were not required to provide. And it ended up being that the Republican candidate for governor won by a pretty slim margin. The Democrats later sued, producing affidavits from 80 voters saying they left because of these guards. And then the RNC was banned from doing nationally organized ballot security programs, including voter caging. but those restrictions are gone as of 2018, and the RNC is spending $20 million on poll watching efforts. We don't know what that will look like, but we do know that Donald Trump Jr. Produced a video in September, I believe, saying, I should have been stepping through these, saying don't let the radical left steal the election, saying the left is going to add millions of fraudulent ballots, and encouraging supporters to enlist an Army for Trump election security operation to help us watch them. Now, we don't know what the official efforts from the campaign and the RNC will look like, but obviously the rhetoric and the false claims of a rigged election, even just as it applies to absentee voting, is raising fears that people will organize outside of the RNC and the campaign to do their own vigilante poll watching operations. So you probably read that absentee voting is secure, but I'm hoping this puts a little more meat on those bones, gives you a little bit more substance on why it's secure, why widespread voter fraud is a myth, and how that myth opens the doors towards more damaging voter suppression efforts. So that's it, and I'm gonna hand it off.
All right.
Thanks.
Thank you, Will. That was Will Adler, CDT Senior Technologist for Elections and Democracy. Following Will, speaking, we'll have Emma Alonso, who is the director of CDT's Free Expression Project. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thank you, Will, for that really informative and then very concerning kind of foray into all of the challenges that we're seeing with kind of information and messaging about the election. So what I'm going to talk about this morning is some of the work that CDT has been doing around online election misinformation and specifically its relationship to voter suppression. As I'm sure everyone on this call knows, election misinformation is a big sprawling issue and can encompass everything from foreign interference campaigns, domestic interference campaigns, misleading information about a candidate's positions or endorsements of the candidates, and so much more. We've been really focusing very specifically on what we're calling voter suppression misinformation, information that could discourage or even prevent people from casting their ballot. We think this is important for a lot of reasons, but especially this year in 2020, with there being so much novelty in the election process. So many people are going to be voting in ways that they've never really voted before. You're not going to have necessarily the same, same polling place with the same procedures that you voted in every election in person on election day for the past 20 years. You might be voting by mail for the very first time. Many states have new procedures and new policies. There are so many deadlines flying around about when you have to request a ballot, when you have to get that ballot postmarked, all of the procedures that Will was just talking about. We think there's, in addition to all of the kind of politically motivated and very intentional disinformation campaigns, there's going to be just a lot of opportunity for honest mistakes and genuine questions about what are the election policies and procedures for the 2020 election. And we really want to emphasize that kind of this key point that content doesn't have to be intentionally misleading or inaccurate in order to have a voter suppression effect. If I good-naturedly share the wrong deadline for getting your absentee ballot postmarked, that post could still end up in some voters casting ballots that are disqualified because they mailed them too late. And some potential voter suppression content won't necessarily fall clearly into an obviously true or false kind of paradigm. As Will was just discussing, we're seeing a lot of discussion around poll watching and poll watching as a voter intimidation tactic. We've already seen, and we saw in the 2018 election, a whole kind of genre of posts about the question of people taking guns to polling places, either people warning others there might be people with guns at the polling places, or people saying, I expect violence at the polling place, so I'm going to take my gun. It can be really hard to try to draw the line of, well, this is an inaccurate or a false statement, and maybe it should be taken down, or this is a true statement of actual fact of what's happening at the polling place on election day and should be allowed to spread to inform people. So we think it's really important to understand the complexity of the threat of voter suppression to help us think carefully about how to counter it. We've been working in particular with elections officials and other public authorities to help them understand what these threats are, all of the different ways that different kinds of misinformation could lead to people not being able or not feeling comfortable in casting their ballot. And we focused on election officials in particular because of their unique role as purveyors of accurate, trustworthy, authoritative information about elections procedures and voting procedures. We need elections officials to be helping to fill up the data voids that are out there about things that can be as dry and sort of technical as voting procedures. If people are looking for accurate information online about how to cast their ballot or what the rules are, for example, about wearing masks at going to in-person polling places, either for early voting or voting on election day, they need to be able to quickly and easily find authoritative information. So we've produced a guide for elections officials to help them understand the many different kinds of risks of voter suppression information that their voters might be encountering online, and to think through different ways that they can produce clear, accurate, consistent, and targeted information at different points in the election cycle so that that content is actually available where people might be looking for it, for example, on social media platforms. Of course, all of this work with elections officials and with voters trying to get people access to good, accurate information on online platforms is happening against a backdrop of an enormous amount of policy activity, all swirling around issues of Section 230, content moderation, and what platforms can and will actually do to help combat voter suppression content on their services. As Alex Gibbons mentioned at the top of our call, in June, CDT actually filed a lawsuit in DC District Court against President Trump's executive order around social media and content moderation. That executive order has a lot of moving parts. Happy to go into kind of more detail in discussion later on, but as a whole, CDT is arguing that the executive order violates the First Amendment as an unconstitutional extra-legal effort to coerce and intimidate online services and social media companies in particular away from doing the kind of work fighting against voter suppression content that we all so desperately want them to do. The executive order is really designed to make companies afraid to do things like fact check the president or fact check anybody else who is sharing inaccurate information about the integrity of our election systems or the mechanics of voting, to take down content that is clearly designed to threaten and intimidate voters. This kind of extra legal censorship that we're seeing through the executive order, that we're seeing through President Trump using every tool that he can possibly lay his hands on to threaten and intimidate content moderators, is really ultimately deprives all of us of access to accurate information online and the ability to find online services that are operating free from governmental coercion. So we think this is an enormous issue. We have filed our lawsuit, responded to the government's motion to dismiss. We don't expect really any more movement on that case before the election, but it's 2020, so who's to say? But we'd also note that, that our friends over at Electronic Frontier Foundation and Rock the Vote have also filed with a number of other organizations in California court. So there are kind of cases on both sides of the country moving through the process, and a lot of folks out there trying to raise the alarm about what the president is doing. And I'll just note briefly that it's not only this executive order where we're seeing these ideas about jeopardizing the legal protections that online services have for doing things like removing misinformation or doing fact checking. We've seen a flurry of proposals in Congress around Section 230 aimed at changing or amending or revoking the law entirely in different ways, including a proposal from Senator Graham that's being pushed through the Senate Judiciary Committee that goes directly to these issues of making it more legally risky for services to do fact checking and to take down any content outside of a kind of very narrow category of information. we're also seeing exactly these same ideas come up in the NTIA's petition for rulemaking to the FCC, another area where I don't think I have time to get into in detail right now, but happy to take questions. I'll just say that we were really disappointed to see the FCC and Chairman Pai's announcement yesterday that they would be moving forward with a rulemaking in this area. As CDT and many other commenters said in the comment process around the NTIA's petition, FCC doesn't have authority to do this, and it's what they're proposing to do, or what the NTIA proposed to do in their petition for rulemaking has constitutional issues, statutory issues, and is just not the right policy approach to resolving any of the issues that we see with online content these days. So it's really disappointing to see the FCC kind of further drawn into the partisan politics that are being played with Section 230 right now. And we anticipate that whatever comes out of the FCC in this rulemaking will immediately be challenged in court. So with that cheery note, I'll stop and hand it back over to Elizabeth.
Okay, thank you, Emma. All right, so that was Emma Alonso, CDT's Director of Free Expression. And next up, we have Mallory Noddell, who is CDT's Chief Technology Officer. Welcome, Mallory.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks very much to Will and Emma, who've laid out our main points at this moment in time on election security, which is to talk about the trust we can have in mail-in voting and the risks with voter suppression and how mis and disinformation undermine both of those things. I wanted to now talk about work that CDT has done for many years on election security, just to remind everyone the importance of cybersecurity and how CDT tends to engage and what kinds of subjects we can be resources for you on. So we, in our cybersecurity in elections program, we have provided guidance, documentation, trainings for election officials. So at this moment in time, elections are very much underway. And so our work then has shifted from speaking and supporting directly election officials to being able to analyze incidents as they happen, and also just begin to collect evidence and rationale for why cybersecurity needs to always be prioritized as a process for any responsible party working on elections in this country. So the main goals then, of course, for that work are to prevent incidents from happening, to stop breaches, hacking, all of those buzzwords. But more generally, it's because CDT strongly believes in strengthening the trust and confidence in our democratic systems. And so it is part and parcel of that to both practice good cybersecurity hygiene when responsible for such important data, such as voter registration data or the votes themselves, the ballots themselves, and all the things that go into that. So as to demonstrate then to the public that they can then trust it. So it's actually, in a lot of ways, you can think of it as a strategy to avoid issues around disinformation and misinformation that lead to mistrust and distrust in not just the results, but in the democratic system itself. It's really key to our strategy to strengthen that. So we know that the election officials have already largely then put into place their plan and their rollout for the general election coming up. And so again, just to remind everyone that but I just wanted to make one final point because I'm not quite sure when I cut out, which is that we be looking out by the end of the year, a report out from CDT on a cybersecurity agenda for US elections, because we are going to see incidents. We want to be able to respond specifically to those incidents, but in the long term. So CDT's focus on election systems, cybersecurity is a long-term vision. We work on the guidance that comes from the federal government and goes into local regions. And we continue to develop accessible documentation on these very complicated technical topics and to roll out trainings. And so we need to continue to prioritize the long-term strengthening of cybersecurity because it's a process, not really a destination. And that's the work that we'll continue to do. So that was all I wanted to end with, but I appreciate also any questions coming our way about things like data and hacking, etc.
Okay, thank you, Mallory. That was Mallory Noddell, CDT's Chief Technology Officer. Okay, so with that, we're going to turn it over to a period of questions and answers. Before we do that, I do want to go ahead and do one more housekeeping note. For anyone who's unfamiliar with CDT, CDT is a 501c3 nonprofit, and we're nonpartisan. So that means that we don't take a position on any particular candidate. So I just want to let you guys know to keep that in mind as you're submitting questions. You know, we can only speak from a nonpartisan perspective while not taking a position on any particular candidates. So again, I'll remind you that you can find CDT's election-related work at cdt.org/election-security. The link is again at the top of the chat. CDT's latest resources are available there, and those include public service announcement videos on mail-in voting and misinformation and disinformation, and a short guide on how to spot and counter online voter suppression. So with that, I'll turn it over to questions from the audience. We do have an inaugural question from Mark Rockwell with Federal Computer Week. His question is, leaders of the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, have said they're confident their work with states to secure election systems from cyber attacks and manipulation has been effective. What is your opinion of these preparations? Have they been adequate, effective? And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to our team for answers.
Okay, so I can take this one. It's a really good question. I think it's true that there's not a single election official in the country that wasn't put on high alert after 2016 by the reports that the Russians scanned every state or almost every state voter registration system and were potentially in a position to alter records in some of them. It's also true that there's been a ton of effort put into this by CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency of DHS, and others. But cybersecurity is an active process. Threats are constantly changing and evolving, so we need to keep making the case that election officials need to prioritize cybersecurity and not be complacent. There will be mistakes, and recovery will have to include building back up the system and any lost trust. But we are confident in the measures that have been taken across the country since 2016. But I would put some caveats on that. So the first caveat is even an unsuccessful attack, if detected and publicized, can prepare the grounds for misinformation and disinformation and undermine confidence, which is the Russian goal of sowing chaos and division. So it doesn't have to be a major breach, or there doesn't have to be an altering for people to sow distrust. Second is, even though counties have done a lot of work to secure their systems since 2016, there's still about 3,000 counties and county equivalents in the US. So it's of course possible that one of those counties is doing a less than stellar job. And again, even an insignificant breach in a small county could create misinformation about statewide or countrywide issues and undermine confidence. And then the third is that even though there have been improvements with cybersecurity, partly due to a lack of funding, too many counties are still using devices with known security vulnerabilities, no paper trail, or both. Some states have upgraded their systems, but there's still plenty of counties that are using systems that we know are highly problematic. And this raises the importance of securing machines physically so no one can alter the software. But unfortunately, we've seen some lapse in physical security this election season already. But I still think it's unlikely that this kind of a breach swings an election result. And speaking of physical security, we also, I think our election official field guides were mentioned earlier, and our most recent one was on physical security, which there's some new physical security considerations in the age of COVID. So maybe Tim, if you could put that in the chat too, that would be great.
Okay, thanks, Will. It looks like we have a couple more questions. So we'll start. I see one from Laurel Yancey. So what is CDT's stance on the FCC crafting website moderation rules?
Sure, yeah, hi Laurel, this is Emma Alonso. I'm happy to take that one. So I mentioned a little bit kind of in my chat earlier, but we think that this is absolutely the wrong move for the FCC to go down this route. There is simply not authority for the FCC to craft rules kind of reinterpreting Section 230 away from what Congress wrote and what courts have interpreted and applied in the 24 years since Section 230 went into effect. This is kind of a really shocking jurisdictional grab from the FCC. Unfortunately, not very surprising, but it's still really well outside the bounds of anything that you could read into the statute on its face. There have not been rules from the FCC about Section 230 and over the past 24 years, and there's really no basis for them to do so. This is exactly the kind of governmental regulation of online speech that back in the 90s, people were really concerned about. The idea that the FCC's kind of approach to broadcast regulation could get ported over to this then new medium, the internet. So it's not at all clear what they're going to do or say here. I think we can imagine they will likely pull from the White House and the DOJ's playbook of kind of amendments and changes to Section 230. But frankly, most of what we've seen proposed, both in Congress and in the White House and DOJ kind of legislative proposal, are in fact legislative changes to the underlying statute. That's not something that the Federal Communications can do. That would be something for Congress to do. So I think it's just the wrong venue entirely to be having these discussions about what changes to the statute should look like, because the FCC can't unilaterally rewrite the law. As far as like what they could do crafting rules to interpret the law, I think any court is going to look at those very skeptically, both for the jurisdictional question, but also just the sheer, what is the impact on people's speech of these changes to how Section 230 works actually going to be?
Thank you, Emma. So we have another question from Chip Pitts. So that is, even though the voting misinformation is only one facet of the problem, what does CDT think can be done about the larger tidal wave of greater propaganda and misinformation being spread via technology at the expense of democracy and other rights?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one too. So I think pretty obviously CDT thinks there needs to be a strong and clear legal framework that enables online services to do content moderation, to be able to address that kind of issue. So that's why, you know, we think the kinds of protections that we have in Section 230 here in the US are as important as they are, because they provide the kind of the legal framework that enables services to try different things to address what are in fact very complex issues of misinformation and disinformation. Having that strong legal framework in place, we also then need platforms to do the work, to try different things about addressing different kinds of misinformation. I think there's unfortunately no one magic answer, no one shiny red button that you could push and make all of the propaganda go away. But I think there are some interesting experiments out there from different services. One thing that comes immediately to mind is a relatively new feature on Twitter, where before somebody goes to retweet a link to something, Twitter posts a pop-up message just saying, are you sure you want to retweet this before you've clicked the link and read the article? Twitter here only sees kind of the information on its platform, so it can only see whether you've clicked that link from Twitter. So mostly I've seen people on my Twitter feed commenting on this of, I wrote the darn article and now I'm trying to share it with people. I've read it before. But it is a kind of speed bump that is a really interesting, I'm interested to see how it plays out. And I really hope that Twitter is kind of studying the impact of that policy and provides public reporting about how they see that kind of speed bump changing behavior on the service, because it's the sort of tweak or nudge that helps feed into really the core answer to the problem, which is kind of media literacy and the role of people in understanding and sharing content. There's a lot that we think needs to be done around issues of, for example, advertising transparency and understanding more about how different people out there are paying to promote and target certain information at certain populations. There's a huge part of the kind of misinformation and propaganda machine that is very much fueled by advertising content. So there's a lot of work to be done in that sort of silo, but a lot of propaganda gets shared in the kind of the quote unquote organic or unpaid space, where it is the kind of effect of people sharing information and deciding to tweet links without reading them, or share information with their friends without knowing or caring about what the source is. So there's a lot of different attack surfaces here to this problem. And one thing that we know kind of across the board is we want to see a lot more transparency and reporting about internal research from the platforms, so that we can understand how they're studying the problems, what things that they're doing, what they see the impact of those being. But we also need to get more access to information and data for independent researchers who can go in and conduct their own studies and kind of verify some of what we're hearing from the platforms, because these are really big, complicated problems. There's no one crystal clear solution to them, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and we need to be able to double check what the services are saying about the impact of the potential solutions that they're rolling out.
Okay, thank you, Emma. Okay, so we have one more question from Rob Pecoraro. So that is, by known vulnerabilities, are we talking about voting machine vulnerabilities that require local access, so hard to scale, or can be exploited remotely, so easy to scale?
I can go ahead and respond, but also I want Will to as well. So go ahead, Will.
So when I was talking, I was mostly referring to vulnerabilities that require local access. Those are the things where we've seen like demos, like at DEF CON Voting Village every year. They do these kind of local attacks to show that they're possible. I think those are hard to scale, as you said. There's been there's a lot of hubbub about some voting machines that have modems, and the vulnerabilities that could pose if those if voting machines were connected to the internet at any point in an unsecured way. I think those vulnerabilities are theoretically possible, but to my knowledge, there haven't been any demonstrations that these machines that people are worried about could how easy they are to put malicious code on them. So I'm not. Yeah, I think we'll have to see. It's of course theoretically possible, but I don't know if it's realistic. Mallory.
I think you said it perfectly well, and it was in response to something you delivered earlier. So I actually don't have anything to add.
Okay.
All right, question from Mary Piper. Can you address the issue of fake drop boxes that have been popping up in some states? How widespread is this, and what is being done about it? Do you have any idea how many voters may have been misled and what they suspect what they should do when they suspect they put their ballot in one?
Yeah, this is a really interesting issue, and I think it's still developing. And to answer the last question, I don't know how widespread it is or how many voters have been misled. What we're seeing in the news this week is this issue that's playing out in California, where there are Republican groups who are putting fake drop boxes in Republican areas in the state to try to collect friendly ballots and then return those. And this is raising legal issues about that related to who can handle a completed absentee ballot. And these rules are different in every state. So in some states, you cannot touch someone else's absentee ballot unless you meet some very strict criteria. But in other states, you can actually collect absentee ballots from lots of people. I think the Attorney General of California said this is illegal, and the group says no, it's not. So they're, I guess, going to be fighting about whether they can have these ballot drop boxes that are meant to in a friendly way to collect local ballots and return them. Of course, it's also possible, though I haven't seen any reports, that you could install ballot boxes in an unfriendly. You could install ballot boxes in an area that you're politically against, collect those ballots, and then throw them away. I don't know if that's actually happening. Certainly, that would be illegal. But yeah, I wish I knew. I wish I knew how more widespread of a problem this was.
Okay, thank you, Will. All right, if anybody has any more questions, I'll just give everyone just a minute to submit any via press@cdt.org or via the chat. But I do want to go ahead and say thank you to everybody for joining. This has been, I hope everyone has found the briefing very informative, and I want to remind everyone that you can always reach us via email at press@cdt.org, or if you need any information about attribution, we have names and bios of all of our experts available at cdt.org/staff. All right, okay, so not seeing any further questions, I do just want to go ahead and say thank you. Again, you can find our work at cdt.org/election security, and you know where to reach us. So, all right, if you have any questions leading up to November 3rd or afterwards, please let us know. All right, thank you so much, everyone, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.